thank you, Doya. Thanks to you and Umberto for inviting me to come and talk a little bit about horses. What I'm going to start off really has been prefigured already by Doya, Tamsin, and also Umberto. This is one of my favourite pictures showing the scale of livestock improvement in the early modern period. He's kind of very happy on the top, blowing his trumpet, presumably at the large beast that he's created. And as we've seen over the last 25 years, there's been considerable interest by zooarchaeologists in tracking and documenting size and shape change in the size of different domestic livestock. And as we've seen from the papers presented so far, there's a great deal of difference in the in regional variability, with some sites showing a long trajectory of change, other sites showing a very rapid change in size change in domestic livestock. In Britain, which is where I'm familiar with, we seem to see a core and periphery model, where we see the size changes in central sites or sites that are closer to the mainland Europe. They seem to show size changes much earlier than sites that are on the periphery. And this is, the trajectory is really complicated. And we know that the 16th century is really important in terms of the livestock size change. This has kind of been really well demonstrated already, but this is actually part of a longer-term direction of travel, if you like. So these are some data that we presented for cattle, sheep, pig, and also for chickens from London. This came out a few years ago now, 2013. And really we can see from these data, we can see that actually the size change happening, I'm not going to use that, the size change happening from the 14th century onwards, and there's a gradual increase in size in both in cattle, sheep and pigs, until we get to about the 18th and 19th century, and everything sort of drops off a little bit when we get a shift away from improving for the sheer size, from bulk, towards actually targeting specific productive characters. And in fact, there's a drive in the 18th and 19th century to develop animals that have less bone in their body, because you have more meat and fat. But just to show you some of the scale of that change, we've got data for chickens from the Roman period onwards, and you can just see the sheer scale of that episode of improvement in the late medieval period and the early modern period compared with what has gone on for the previous 1,000 years or so. It really is quite astonishing. So we know that the 16th century is important for the improvement of domestic livestock, or the increase in size of domestic livestock, but I very much see this as part of a longer term direction of travel rather than anything potentially unique in the 16th century itself. But you'll see that the papers we've had so far, they've talked about cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, but horses. I mean, we had, Tamsin was mentioned, horses, about their centrality to agriculture, but also to warfare, to the movement of goods, transport and trade, and yet nobody has really tackled, from a zooarchaeological point of view, the kind of improvement or the change, the investment in breeding programs in the horses from an archaeological point of view. And that's really a twofold problem. The first problem that we have is that the numbers of horse bones we have on archaeological sites are generally very few. So we don't have many sites with a lot of horse bones. Horses tend to be disposed of away from settlement sites, whereas the kind of bones, the cattle, the sheep and the pig, they're consumption refuse. So we tend to find these bones on occupation sites. But also because we know that horse carcasses are very well and very effectively recycled. We have production of leather, we have the horses get knackered, for example, and so on. And so we don't see so many of them on archaeological sites. So there hasn't been great ability for us to kind of look at breeding programs in horses. It's also a fault of our own methods as well, because as zooarchaeologists, we tend to be obsessed with the withers heights, the shoulder heights of horses, which is lovely because we can visualise how tall a horse is by its shoulder. But that means you have to have complete long bones to be able to do that kind of analysis, which reduces our sample massively. So yes, it's important and interesting, but it does mean we're hampering our own ability to do these kinds of studies. So using the same data set that we used for the domestic livestock from London that I showed you at the beginning, we've pulled together all the horse bone measurements from London that have been collated since the 1990s by zooarchaeologists working at the Museum of London, and to try and track changes in the shape and size of horses. And this is zooarchaeologists systematically recording every single site that's been excavated in London for, well, for a good 25 years or so. And you can see the number of measurable horse bones is still really small. There's not many horses actually making it into the city. But we've done this is. We've broken down our data into sort of 8 sort of overlapping periods of time, spanning the 13th through to the 19th century. And we've taken the view to kind of not only calculate withers heights for these horses, but also to try and look at individual bone measurements, as we would for cattle and sheep, as has been presented already. So we pulled these data together, and I'm going to show you a couple of charts to show you what kind of patterns have emerged from that. If we start, I'm going to focus mostly on the 16th century as I go into my discussion, but for now I'm going to show you the kind of whole data set. If we look at the very first period, we've got this kind of 13th to mid-14th century. We can see a huge diversity of horses, huge diversity in the size of horses. Our smallest stands about 13.3 hands high, which is very firmly sort of pony size. Our tallest is about 16 hands high, so we might think of like a Shire horse, a really big, a big horse. But huge diversity of horse size. Then there's a massive crash, a really massive crash in the size of horses in the mid-14th or the later 14th and into the 15th century, and a real reduction in the diversity of sizes before we get into the late 15th and into the 16th century, where we see a significant increase. In fact, an increase that results in a sort of mean and medium-sized horses well above those that we saw in the 13th and 14th centuries. Thereafter, sort of as we get into the late 17th century, not much change. Another size increase in horses as we get into the 17th century, and then again, fairly static sort of mean size of horses as we move into the 18th century. 19th century is problematic. We don't have much data. When we looked at the just the log scale measurements, we only had measurements for lengths and breadths. Again, if you're working on archaeological projects or you're working with zooarchaeologists, make sure that they're taking measurements in all anatomical planes of the animal, because length tells us about height, but we want to know about the widths and the depths of these animals. The shape is really important, as Adoya was mentioning earlier. But the lengths show the same trajectory, and the breadths and lengths show the same dip in size, the same drop in size in horses, statistically significant in that 14th century, followed by a real bounce back by the time we get into the 16th century, and then again another rise again as we go to the 17th century. In general, lengths tend to show a gradual increase from the 16th century onwards. Breadths, the widths of the animals are a bit more stochastic. It probably reflects the small size of the samples and the fact that we've got different shapes of horses in different periods, which needs to be teased out. But generally, we've got some trends in both data sets that help us understand what's going on in terms of the size and shape of horses. So we can say that in the 13th and mid-14th century, horses are very variable in size. The horse that's reached 16 hands high, this is an interesting specimen because that's the height that the warhorse, the medieval warhorse, would have reached, the destrier, the intact male. So could potentially have some evidence for that. They're remarkably absent from the archaeological record for the medieval period. We've got a big decline in size in the mid-14th to 15th century. An increase in size again by the time we get into the later 15th and into the 16th century. The average height of the horse is sort of at this point 14 hands high. Compare that with sort of 13 hands high in the 13th century. We've got another, by the time we get to the 17th century, the horses are hitting sort of a 15 hands high, with far fewer sort of small horses and ponies, and not really much that we can say about what's going on in the 18th and 19th century. Clearly no evidence for the introduction of thoroughbreds that we can see, at least from the City of London at this time. So they're the general patterns in the data set. I'm going to focus on these two because they relate to the themes of the session, about this sort of long 16th century and what's the lead up, what's causing this drop in size in horses, and then what's causing the subsequent increase in size in the 16th century. So first of all, thinking about the drop in horse size, we've already had the Black Death has been prefigured by a number of presentations, quite conveniently. One of the outcomes of the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century was a real significant drop in aristocratic income. So the real aristocratic income really falls as a result of the sort of demographic collapse. And one of those things that horse breeding is a practice of the elite, primarily in the medieval period, and it's expensive business, and it may have been one of the casualties of that loss of income. It may have also been negatively affected by the continued reduction in forests, wastes, and chases in the medieval period that had been previously used as places for studs. This is where the studs were located. But these were converted, particularly for husbandry and for pasture, as medieval lords tried to diversify their income after the Black Death. So there's a gradual reduction in the land given over to these kinds of spaces. Throughout the 14th century, you have ongoing warfare, which really leads to a breakdown of national and international trade, and also a decimation of stocks. These horses are being requisitioned for warfare. There's a huge loss of horses. Where they all are, that's a really interesting question. But there's a huge loss of horses as a result of ongoing warfare. And in combination, these factors would have reduced the size of the populations of horses. The smaller your populations, the less able you are to select animals for breeding. So there is a correlation between livestock breeding and size of holdings or size of stock, but also it would have been a sort of lack of control, reduction in control over selection of stallions and mares as horse breeding becomes disinvested. Disease and environmental change may have also been influential factors. We know that in 1360, King Edward III, he reduced his stud after disease, murrain, broke out regularly and indiscriminately. And we know that there was a succession of harvest failures throughout the 14th century leading up to the Black Death that would have also meant that horses would not have been fed over winter. So it would have also have minimised reduce the health of the horses and therefore not allow them to reach their genetic potential. So these may have also been sort of contributing factors to this kind of big drop in horse size that we see in the later 14th century and onwards. By the time we get to the Tudors, so by the time we get into the 16th century, the early 16th century, it's a pretty sorry state of affairs. The War of the Roses, which is effectively a civil war in England, has resulted in the late 15th century, has resulted in another major loss of horse stocks. And Henry VIII, writing in 1536, I think, describes the horses of this realm now lately diminished, altered, and decayed. And if we look at contemporary illustrations of horses in this period, we can see just how far below the barrels the legs of the rider sit. They're almost dragging along the floor. These are not really adequate war horses of the kind that Henry VIII really wanted, Henry VII and Henry VIII wanted for their cavalry, which was really important part of their sort of warfare in the 16th century. So there was a whole series of legislations that were enacted during the 16th century to reverse this effective decay that had been identified in horses. The legislation centred on three areas, effectively, one of which was the prohibition of export of horses, breeding age horses, mares and stallions, because all the good horses were being sent abroad. So there was decrees to prevent that. There was legislation to control the size of breeding age horses. So all again, it's aimed at the aristocracy really. All owners of game parks of a certain size had to keep mares of breeding age at least 13 hands high. There was a big problem of horses. The stallions would wander around effectively. They'd be left on common ground or waste ground, and they would basically cover the mares, which basically meant there was no regulation, no control of breeding of those animals. So there was a decree to ensure that all stallions over 2 years of age on common ground or waste ground could not be under 14 or 15 hands high, depending on where you were in the country. And there was also laws to try and increase the number of horses. So there was a law to dictate how many stallions and how many mares that members of the aristocracy, depending on your status, depending on your class, depending on where you were in that sort of aristocratic pyramid, how many mares and stallions you should have to provide for the saddle and cavalry horses needed for warfare. And this legislation existed for almost 100 years. Odd bits were repealed during the reign of Elizabeth, but more or less remained in place for over 100 years, and was certainly assisted or made easier. The regulation of horse breeding was probably made a lot easier by the progressive enclosure of land. We also know another strategy that the Tudor that was employed during the Tudor period was the import of horses. They were certainly imported in considerable numbers in the 16th century. Henry VIII was very keen. He moved away from this sort of fairly unregulated system of studs that were farms that were taking place in forests and wastes and chase that happened in the medieval period, and actually concentrated resources in a few specialised stud farms. And we know by 1576 there's a survey of two of those royal studs revealed a high proportion of both mares and stallions that had come from Italy, from Spain, from North Africa and from Turkey. And if you start reading some of the contemporary authors of the 16th century, people like Thomas Blunderville, Gervase Markham, they write about the virtues of the foreign, the exotic horse. I mean, there's always this thing about the power of, it was really important in the 16th century, the power of the exotic was, and the power of the external was rated very highly. And that's seen certainly in the case of the horses. So we get an awful lot of importation. Well, the question is that it's very much about the elite. I mean, do we have any evidence for breeding in other contexts, improvement of horses in other contexts? Well, difficult to say. We have this issue, the same issue that Doyle was referencing, the fact that we tend to have an absence of rural sites, which make it very difficult to make that kind of comparison. We do know there might have been some push factors for increasing the size of horses. We know there is a big growth in industry and trade in the 16th century, requiring the need for carts and wagon horses. We have this transition from ploughing with cattle to horses, which begins in the 13th century but continues as we move into the 16th century, particularly on the lighter soil areas. We also have the fashion for heavy horses emerge with the introduction of coaches and carriages. I think the first coach is introduced in 1564. So there's some other pressures driving the need for larger horses. Question is this innovation? Is this 16th century innovation? Can we call it that in terms of what we see in horse breeding? I think what we can say is the direction of travel for horse breeding was different than it was for other livestock. It doesn't follow the same pattern. For other livestock, for cattle, for sheep, for pigs, for chickens, the increases in size are part of a longer-term direction of travel which really, I think, have its origins in the agricultural reorganisation after the Black Death. We also have to think about social phenomena. In the 16th century, in the 15th and 16th century, we've got a new landed class of gentry trying to our new aristocracy, if you like, their new money, trying to make their money in agriculture. And one of the ways they try and bestow, they didn't have the heritage of other aristocratic families, and one way they can express their own status is by showing off their breeding prowess and showing off just how large their livestock are. This is why we get these wonderful paintings of these really fat pigs or cows or sheep. It's showing off. It's about what you can do. So there is some status seeking in having large livestock, and we mustn't all think it's all about economics. But of course, there was an economic imperative as well. There is an economic drive as we get into the 16th century to meet the demands of that growing population that Carenza was talking about. But the horses are different. The increase in size happens in the 16th century. So when other livestock are increasing in the 14th and 15th century, the horses' size is declining. But the major increase in size of horses happens in the 16th century. It seems to have been largely driven by a legislated programme of positive breeding strategies. But the breeding strategy was driven by a need to arrest degeneration. It was to try and make things as they were, as they used to be. If you read all the legislation, it's not about trying to make things better from even better than they are now. It's about trying to recover a situation. But we also know that this through introduction of new bloodlines as well. For horses, at least in the 16th century, there doesn't seem to be much interest in improved feeding regimes for horses. It all seems to be about either breeding, seems to be the main imperative. We've got this lovely quote by Giovanna Michel. I'm going to mispronounce my Italian. Sorry, Umberto.
Doesn't sound Italian.
Apparently he is. But anyway, he describes how Britain produces more horses than any other region in Europe, but the horses being weak and of bad wind, fed merely on grass, just like other animals. They cannot stand much work, and they would do much better if they were fed. There doesn't seem to be much investment, much interest in improving the nutrition of horses. It's all about the breeding, which again tells you something a bit about status, maybe. I would contend that there is no innovation in practice. The knowledge that height, stature of horses was primarily an inherited characteristic was understood by legislators. They knew that you had to control the height of mares and stallions to make sure that you can increase the size of your horses. So the knowledge was there, the knowledge that these are inherited characters, that size is an inherited character and could be influenced by breeding, existed. And we certainly know from the archaeological evidence that that was the case for cattle, sheep, pigs and chickens back in the late 14th century. So I would contend there's no innovation in practice. What is innovative, I think, for the 16th century was this is the first time we've got enforcement of breeding practices through a sustained and successful programme of regulation. So I think this is the first time we see the real top-down. And I think this is why we get a different pattern of development for other domestic livestock. I still have the feeling that we're looking at more of a bottom-up improvement for other domestic livestock, but for horses, as a practice of elite control, we have a sort of a top-down initiative to result in that increases in size. Thank you.